Phenomenology is comparative, that means, one compares the givens of one thing with the givens of another thing. For example, one can compare the object perception with the imagination and analyze what is the difference between a perceived book and an imagined book. Husserl also does this by comparing the immanent and transcendent objects of perception. By something transcendent, Husserl understands objects that are outside of me, for example a book. Husserl described immanent objects as follows: but if we pay attention to the plenitude of time, and in particular to the primal impressional phases, we are confronted with the radical difference between the appearance of transcendent and immanent objects. The immanent object has only one possible way of being given in the original, and that is why each past mode has only a single series of time modal modifications, namely that of visualization with the changing constructed past. He means that there is another kind of object, the immanent object. Immanent objects are part of me, for example headaches. When you have a headache, you have an awareness of that headache. You can describe the headache, for example it gets more intense. You can also roughly localize the headache, for example at the back of the head or on the forehead. But there is no perspective. You can't look at the headache from the right side or anything like that. There is no shadowing. The immanent object are objects as a whole, as it were, as a full thing, and have only one past mode, namely it is gone. Thus, there is no pretension and retention. The immanent object does not develop co-consciousness. It is present like a transcendent object, but the present is a different one, namely a present which is present in the moment of the present in such a way that when you no longer have it, you believe that the immanent object is gone. Using the headache example, this means when your headache is gone, you don't ask yourself where your headache is. You won't look anywhere for your headache once it's gone. Because headaches present themselves the moment you feel the pain is something you know, if you don't have it, doesn't exist. In contrast, if you see a passing car, you'll still believe that car exists long after it's out of sight. There is something connected with the transcendent object that would also exist independently of you. When I see my book, I see something, which for me is something I have to believe, because I perceive that it also exists, even if I wouldn't see it. Even in the matrix, the object perceived is an object that appears to me as an object that is not because I perceive it, but is independent. As already mentioned, it behaves differently with immanent objects. These only exist because I perceive them. Just because you don't have a headache doesn't mean the headache is somewhere else. In the case of immanent objects, one actually no longer speaks of perceiving, but of feeling. So, you should actually say that you feel a headache instead of having it. According to Husserl, the halo, horizon, pretension and retention only exist for transcendent objects. He also says, an immanent object such as a black experience presents itself as a permanent object, and in a certain way also through appearances, but only like any time object in general. That means that you can say that you had a headache for an hour because there is a time structure. This is a typically comparative approach. Husserl now introduces a second level of description of perception because over time he has somewhat changed his style of doing phenomenology. He writes, in these exceedingly complicated and wondrous systems of intention and fulfillment that make appearances, the ever new, ever different appearing object constitutes itself as the same. But it is never finished, never firmly closed. Husserl means the word wondrous literally, since phenomenologists are modest and accept that some things cannot be explained, for example self-awareness. So, he says that the object one perceives is constituted. That is, the object is made by a subject. It is an object because the subject does something, like walking around the object. He writes, perception is not a vacant stare at what's inside consciousness and ever to be put inside by some senseless miracle, as if there was first something and then consciousness somehow embraced it. The perceiver has to do something in order for perception to occur. This is a completely opposite standpoint to Thomas Reid's constitution theory of perception. He was of the opinion that there is a material, a sensation, that is to be interpreted, to be read, which gives rise to a perception. This theory is probably the most popular constitution theory. According to Reid, object perception can be explained as follows: my eyes perceive light stimuli, the brain interprets these stimuli, which leads to the conclusion that I see a table. In neuroscience, one proceeds from a theory of unconscious activity. There are sensations and an edit. The stimuli that are felt reach the brain, and the brain somehow processes these stimuli. The theory works on the idea that an unconscious material comes together with an unconscious activity, and a conscious something arises from it. This theory works with entities no human has ever seen. Charms have never been seen before. What is a sensation or sense material supposed to be? What should be the basis of a perception? Phenomenologists are opposed to this theory of unconscious activity, since one could replace unconscious activity with anything, such as a god. The processing of sensory stimuli has never been noticed. Something is always assumed. I perceive the book in front of me, but I do not perceive the alleged sensory material and an interpretation of this sensory material. One could now say that all phenomenologists are against interpretationistic theories of perception. So, against a theory of perception where an unconscious process of interpretation is assumed. Because when people talk about unconscious activities, mythology begins, that which is made up. Satter calls it the mythology of the unconscious. Phenomenologists therefore turn against an assumption that does not show itself as a phenomenon. The phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty refutes the whole thing with the following words: the sensation itself is not felt. Consciousness is always consciousness of an object. We only arrive at the concept of sensation when, reflecting on our perception, we want to express that it is never exclusively our own work. We want to say, I see the book, not because I'm imagining it, but because it's an occurrence. In order for the book not to be made by me, there must be material that I interpret. But I don't perceive this material. Merleau-Ponty goes on to say, pure sensation, defined as the action of stimuli on our bodies, is an end product of our knowledge, namely our scientific knowledge. It is merely a very natural delusion that makes us put it at the beginning and prior to all knowledge believe. Biologists would say that the book appealed to my eyes. But how do you know that? I'm conscious of the book, it's only afterwards, after you're conscious of the book, that you make up that story with the unconscious activity and stimuli, argues Ponty. We know that phenomenologists think that one should practice philosophy without resorting to entities of which one has no awareness. That is why there is no unconscious, since the unconscious is defined in such a way that one has no consciousness of it and therefore no awareness of it. This has the same status as assuming a flying spaghetti monster. This means that phenomenology should be opposed to a constitution theory in terms of its attitude. But Husserl saw it differently. This was a turning point in Husserl's thinking. From object phenomenology to transcendental phenomenology. Because transcendental philosophy asks about the conditions of possibility, and Husserl's means that the conditions of the possibility that I perceive a book, for example, also lie in the subject. Husserl also thinks that the subject has to do something, move or something similar, so that the object can be perceived. That means he is a transcendental philosopher because he thinks that the conditions of the possibility of object perception lie in the subject. He is a proponent of the constitution theory of perception because he holds that when I perceive an object, it is a product of a constitution process. Are you wondering how the two should fit together? Very easily. It is a constitution process that is not unconscious, so the two attitudes are not contradictory. The constitution process when perceiving a book, for example, can be experienced. And this constitution process can be experienced by walking around the object. Here the circle to the object phenomenology from the last video closes. Husserl describes the object as a front view, pretension is where I can go, and retention is our past memory of the object. But he means that the accomplishment of this process leads to the object consciousness. So, if you were to be chained to a chair forever with your eyes fixed on some horror movie contraption so that you couldn't move your eyes and the rest of your body, you wouldn't see any objects, only sides. Objects are products of my physical movement. I perceive that I move. This is the key point. Here Husserl introduces a new term, kinesthesia. Kin means movement and aesthesis means perception. Husserl says, we must here refer to an objectification of the object of perception as the essential site of the pneumatic constitution, to the site of kinesthetic motivation. Objectification now becomes an act, there is no such thing as the object, but objectification means I make the object. The phrase means that there is an awareness of my own movement. I have awareness when I walk around the thing or object. This walking around constitutes the object in its full thingness from the individual views of the object. It basically describes why we recognize a film as a film and not as individual frames. Nevertheless, we perceive the individual images, Husserl would argue, but very quickly. With this, Husserl brought about a paradigm shift in the philosophy of perception, since firstly he does not assume any unconscious activity as the reason for the perception of objects, and secondly the subject who perceives is a physical subject because only a physical subject can walk around an object or the eyes move, if it has any. With this video, Husserl's phenomenology of object perception ends. In the next video, I will present Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of object perception, concluding the phenomenology of perception video series for the first